Also possible that an Ukrainian air defense missile missed the Russian target and overflew it and landed in Poland. That's possible too. These things happen. This is the fog of war. And that's why we need to do our best through investigations and deliberate approach to clear the fog so we know exactly what happened before we act.
What do you know about what has happened here? We're hearing that 2 people have been killed inside Poland. What are you hearing about whether it was a Russian missile that caused this?
I think those are the basic facts and all that we know right now. My assumption is that the investigation is ongoing on the ground. They're looking at the wreckage, if you will, and determining whether it's a Russian missile or rocket or componentry. It could be even a Ukrainian air defense missile that's gone astray. We just don't know. So it's important to get to the facts on the ground. Also compare radar tracks from the Poles and from NATO and others to see if we can find the point of origin, and then continue to dig through this and find out what exactly happened before we draw any conclusions.
Yeah, we've heard that Poland's Security Council is meeting this evening. Do you expect NATO to meet tomorrow to discuss whether there should be a response? Because after all, Poland is a NATO member.
Yeah, look, we know that the Polish government has met in the last hour or so. I'm sure discussions are happening within the United States and government and other governments, informal consultations between all of them and the Secretary General. I would not be surprised if Poland made a move for a NATO Article 4 consultation meeting at the North Atlantic Council. That would make sense, just to simply discuss the issue and to coordinate the way forward.
So, what would an Article 4 meeting mean?
An Article 4 meeting it's a consultative meeting whereby the NATO allies would meet at the Atlantic Council level and discuss the situation and coordinate a way forward. Several Poland and I think the Baltic states called for a Article 4 meeting at the beginning of the Russian attack on Ukraine way back when on February 24th. As again, a consultative mechanism expressing their concern about their security. So I would not be surprised if this happens.
And if it did turn out that this was a Russian missile strike, perhaps even one that went astray over the border into Poland, do you think that should trigger a response by NATO?
Well, intentionality means a lot here. We don't know, and my assumption is at this point that it's either poor Russian targeting or a malfunction with the missile or something like that. That it would not demand a military response. It would demand certainly a diplomatic response where we required compel the Russians to answer up, to fess up, to explain what they're doing and how they're going to take preventative measures in the future. And then I think we need to look internally about how we tighten up our air defenses so there are no accidental firings happening again.
Because there have been some suggestions that it's possible that a Russian missile was perhaps hit by Ukrainian defensive weapons and knocked off course.
Sure, and it's also possible that an Ukrainian air defense missile missed the Russian target and overflew it and landed in Poland. That's possible too. These things happen. This is the fog of war. And that's why we need to do our best through investigations and deliberate approach to clear the fog so we know exactly what happened before we act.
Russia has denied that any of its weapons were responsible. It has described this as a deliberate provocation. But if it did turn out that these were Russian missiles, that they hit into Polish territory, that there was carelessness, I mean, what would happen then? Would that perhaps require a bigger response? Because, of course, there is that NATO Article 5, which says that an attack on one member state would be deemed an attack on all.
Look, based on what I understand now, I see that 2 Russian missiles fell. They hit a farmland, tragically killed 2 people, but a small remote town that has no military targeting. It adds up to me to be an accidental launch. And so I don't think it requires a military response against Russia. I do think it requires, again, a consultation, an explanation from Russia about what happened and how they plan to prevent it in the future. And then I think we should discuss how can we tighten up our own air defenses so that if the Russians fell and there is another accidental firing of a missile, then we can prevent it from falling and killing somebody again.
because this attack came on a day that Ukraine suffered more than 100 strikes, many
Right.
of them knocking out power networks. We've got power cuts right across many towns and cities in Ukraine. Even if the Russians did not deliberately target Poland, it did come in the midst of a renewed onslaught.
Absolutely. This seems to be the only play that the Russians have left, which is to attack Ukrainian infrastructure with drones and missiles and rockets and artillery to knock out their energy and break the Ukrainians' will going into the winter. And look, they've been suffering through this for weeks, if not months. And if anything, it points out the fact that we have been late and insufficient in terms of providing the Ukrainians with air defenses. Think how many hundreds of miles those cruise missiles likely traversed Ukrainian airspace before they landed accidentally in Poland, if that proves to be the case. Many, many opportunities are to shoot these things down, and they weren't because the Ukrainians don't have sufficient air defenses.
So, do you think that perhaps the fact that a missile has now landed on Polish soil, could that perhaps be the spur for the West to provide Ukraine with more air defences?
Absolutely. It shouldn't have reached this point. I mean, I'm surprised that we haven't had something like this happen earlier. But yes, the air defenses are woefully inadequate. We have the means to provide them any number of types of air defenses, whether it's missiles or guns that they need to shoot down these new Iranian drones. Knowing that this is one of the few things that the Russians have left in their arsenal, we should be beefing up the Ukrainians so that they can withstand this pummeling and this terrorism that's being perpetrated on them by Moscow.
We've heard international condemnation already of Russia. Russia was very isolated at the G20. But would you have liked to see something rather stronger from those G20 nations? Because, of course, the efforts to try to get everyone to sign up to something, it sounds like we're simply going to get some kind of communique condemning violence.
Yeah, I don't know why Russia was even at the G20, frankly. I think the more isolation, the better. And there is much more we can do, whether it's financial sanctions, economic sanctions, you name it. But we have to put all the pressure we can on them, and unfortunately on the Russian people, because maybe the Russian people will take the matter into their own hands as well. They are suffering too at the hands of Vladimir Putin. Not like the Ukrainians, don't get me wrong, but they are suffering at the hands of this dictator. And now they have seen over the past couple months their young men and being sent off to war to fight in a conflict that is just completely illegal and unwarranted.